On the line with us is Professor Richard Wolff, economist, author. His most recent book, Democracy at Work, professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, visiting professor at the New School in New York City. His website, rdwolf with 2fs.com, and his Twitter handle is Prof Wolff, Profwolff. Professor Wolff, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Tom. Glad to be here.
It's great to have you with us. Over the last, we've been off the air for the last week because we've been moving studios here on the radio show. And so we haven't had an opportunity to really get into what has been happening in the stock markets and what's been going on with China. I'm just wondering if you can give us your analysis, your kind of summary analysis of where we're at, how we got here, where we're going.
Well, the two stories really have only a bit of a connection. That is, the story of the chaotic up and down of the stock market, including today, been going on for a couple of weeks. That's on the one hand. And then on the other, what's happening in China. Its stock market is also in a kind of chaotic gyration up and down. But other than that, the connection between them, how should I say, is overdone, to say the least. Partly that's a kind of continuation of what really has to be called China bashing, trying to figure out how any and every problem that we have here in the United States, or for that matter in the Western world, can be traced with a little intelligence and a great deal of imagination back to China as the bad guy doing the bad thing. You'd almost have to believe that the Cold War never ended to take that stuff seriously.
Well, we were doing this with Japan back in the 70s and 80s, too.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And they used to do it to the Soviet Union on a regular basis. Yeah. But there is, as always, there's a grain of truth. And here's the grain. China is now the second biggest and most important economic unit in the world after only the United States. So on one level, anything that happens in a country that important to the world economy is going to ramify, have effects, and shake things in other parts of the world. That's just a consequence of the very success they've had. It's a little bit especially interesting and troublesome because it's China and because it has gone so fast. I think this is really important to understand. 25 years ago, China ranked among the smallest, economically speaking, and population, of course, was always enormous, but the smallest economically, the poorest, the most backward. And here, literally in one generation, they have rushed ahead of everybody else and become number two. We've never seen that in the history of the world. The transition from a rural agricultural economy that took centuries in places like the United States and Western Europe and Japan has happened in one generation, basically, in China. It's a new world. It is something that could have and should have provoked much more turbulence than, in fact, we've seen. And so we're all kind of slowly coming to terms with the enormity of the transition that has gone on in that part of the world. Number two, along the way, the Chinese, and this is absolutely crucial, made a strategic decision to hitch their star, to make their economy depend on world capitalism. They may have been led by a communist party. They may have talked about their society as socialist. But what they did, and in particular two key decisions, hooked them up, for better or worse, to world capitalism. The first decision was to build their economy, their industry, on an export model. In other words, what the Chinese decided to do was to produce goods and services that they would have to sell someplace else, simply because the Chinese people didn't have the money with which to pay for, to buy, to consume what China wanted to be able to produce. So it decided to make its economic well-being, its industrial growth, dependent upon selling goods, above all, in Western Europe, North America, and Japan. The second big decision was to invite huge multinational capitalist corporations into China, offering the low wages of their working people, offering the support of the government every which way, looking the other way when it came to ecological toxic wastes, looking the other way when it came to working conditions, and so on. And that also, just as importantly, hooked China's economic development and growth onto a capitalist horse, if you like. So here's the punchline. If you depend on the capitalist West to buy what you produce, and if you depend to a large extent, not 100%, but a large extent, on capitalistically owned and operated enterprises inside your country, you can hardly expect to somehow magically avoid the problems that capitalism always brings. And chief among them is economic instability, the business cycle, the downturns, the recessions, the depressions. They have been part of capitalism for 250 years. Every single place that system has become dominant. And now that it has become dominant in and for the Chinese economy, ho, 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 big surprise, they have gyrations of their stock market like we always have. The difference is only now that they're so big in the world, when they have an economic hiccup, everybody else reaches for the handkerchief and hopes that they can contain the coughing fit that emerges out of it.
Yeah. And the Chinese seem to be responding to this by prosecuting reporters who were talking about the stock market going down. And prior to that, they had state-owned enterprises buying $250 billion worth of securities to try to prop the stock market up. Are any of these efforts going to work?
Those particular ones you mentioned, I doubt it very much. They're using everything, by the way. They're everything in the kitchen sink. They are changing the value of their currency. They are changing their interest rates. They are pumping up their money supply. They are stimulating with fiscal policy. And then they're also what we call in this country jawboning,
right.
Having leading politicians say what they hope will then become a reality. Only there in China, they take it the next step and punish those who aren't saying what they want everybody to hear. It's a little scary because what you're observing is a lot of scurrying to try to cope with an economic downturn. And as we know, or at least as we should know from our own history, the efforts of the government to contain economic downturns only work sometimes.
Yeah.
In 1929, they didn't work.
Right.
In 2008, they didn't work. And so there is the anguish and the anxiety grounded in reality that no one knows whether the Chinese problem relative to what the Chinese government is doing will contain this thing before it takes us all down with it.
Right. And in the 30 seconds we have left, what's your guess?
It's too early to tell. My guess is it's a major hiccup along the way, but it won't be a major crash. But there really is no way to tell that in advance. And not the least problem with capitalism is that it goes through these things and that I have to answer questions like this that I can't tell you about something as important as how this crash works out.
Yeah, it's a remarkable thing. And your writings so brilliantly analyze so many of these. Professor Richard Wolff, economist, author, Democracy at Work, among others, professor of economics at the University of Mass and visiting professor at New York School. Professor Wolff, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Tom, and good luck with you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's always great to see you.